right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Um, my name is Courtney Doggart, and I am the president of Network 2020. It is a pleasure to be back here in 2023 with our first briefing of the year, where we're going to be looking at the peace deal in Ethiopia. We have two wonderful experts with us. Before we begin, I did want to say a few words about Network 2020 for those who might be joining us for the first time. So we are an inclusive international community. We're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs communities, which means a number of different things for us, including running webinars like these on topics that are germane to everyone around the world. And we're also run some research projects and additional work that you can find out on our website. We do ask if you like what you hear here, please do feel free to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, LinkedIn. We also post most of our briefings to YouTube as well, so please do subscribe to our channel because that's a great way to support our work. So as we begin, I wanted to just say a few words about our topic today. So when Abiy Ahmed was appointed Prime Minister of Ethiopia in 2018, there was really a lot of hope within the country and the region that political stability and economic prosperity would likely follow. And this was really reinforced in 2019 when Abiy received the Nobel Peace Prize for his agreement to normalize relations with neighboring Eritrea. But by 2020, he was engaged in a brutal civil war with rebels in the Tigray region. So today we really want to dig into what factors led to this dramatic turnaround in Ethiopia's trajectory and how the conflict has impacted the country and the Horn of Africa. We're interested in learning about what is the current status of the peace agreement that was signed last November between the two parties, and how are outside powers like the United States or others influencing developments in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. So we have a really wonderful couple of panelists with us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them now. So first up, we have Alan Boswell, and he is the director of the Horn of Africa project at the International Crisis Group. And he comes with over a decade of experience in East Africa, and he hosts the Crisis Group's podcast, the Horn podcast. So please do check that out if you're interested in the region. And I'm also pleased to welcome Michael Woldemariam as well. He is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a senior fellow at the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. So welcome to both of you. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us about an important and really sensitive topic. So thank you for being with us today. To start, I want to start where I usually like to start, which is a little bit of background and groundwork. So Alan, starting with you, before we turn specifically to the conflict in Ethiopia, could you, just for our audience, give us a primer on the geopolitical importance of the Horn of Africa? Why should we be caring about this region?
Sure, thanks, Courtney, and it's great to be with all you in the audience, and great to be doing this alongside Mike as well. So, I mean, there's a number of quite positive things you can say about the Horn of Africa in terms of its geopolitical importance. It's largely the source of the Nile, one of the world's largest cities, largest rivers, which in the current climate, threatened age that we're facing is of increasing importance. It sits on the Red Sea, which is one of the world's most important waterways, with a lot of trade that goes through it. It is host to Ethiopia, which is the second most populous country in Africa, and which is really set to continue booming in population like a lot of the rest of Africa. I'd say, as though a bit sadly, though, a lot of the geopolitical importance of the Horn has stemmed from a fair amount of negative reasons as well. And I think there's a difference of perspective from different parts of the world. I think it's true that the West and Europe have largely viewed the Horn as a place to project power, but also as a place that exports a lot of issues, whether that's jihadism, especially in the case of Somalia, and for a while In Sudan, Europe has a lot of concerns about migration. There's a fair amount of concerns about trafficking, but a lot of these stem from the basic fact that a lot of the countries that make up the Horn of Africa, which we will be talking about, they have really struggled over the past decades with the most of them with the post-colonial state formation process, although you can't quite say that we can't say that in the Ethiopian context, which has its own history, but these are countries that remain largely unstable, have often, not all of them, but many of them, have basically gone through decades of civil war and cycles of war. And so it is a place that has often attracted great powers who have an interest in stabilizing as well. Again, I think that's very much kind of a Western perspective. I think a lot of the Middle East powers who are increasingly involved, as well as Eastern powers, especially China, see a lot, are looking further ahead and see a lot of the agricultural potential, see geopolitical allies as well. But I think a lot of the geopolitical importance in many ways is that its lack of a clear, strong power within the Horn, although Ethiopia sometimes play that, has invited historically more or less a lot of power competition within the Horn of Africa from the outside. And we're still seeing that today as well.
Great, thank you very much. That's a helpful layout. Mike, turning to you, could you please provide us some historic background to the current event in Ethiopia, to the current conflict?
Sure, happy to do so, and thanks again to Network 2020 for having us and hosting this conversation. If I could just maybe circle back quickly to Alan's response, which I think is a very good one. I think the other reason the Horn of Africa is considered to be of geopolitical importance, or considered to be sort of strategic real estate, is its proximity to really important strategic maritime corridor, right? So the Suez, the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab, a really critical artery of global trade. Almost 90% of trade between Europe and Asia goes right off the coast of the Horn of Africa, which sits astride this particular maritime corridor. So I think it's also important for that reason. I mean, also when you think about this from a sort of naval or military strategy perspective, access to the Western Indian Ocean, the Red Sea becomes really quite important. So I just highlight that point. So in terms of the origins of the recent conflict in Ethiopia, I would probably go back to 2018 with the caveat that the challenges Ethiopia is facing today are very old and of historic nature, right? We could actually take this conversation back to the late 19th century and the formation of the modern Ethiopian state. But effectively what happens in 2018 is the country goes through a political transition and gets a new prime minister who you'd mentioned earlier, Abiy Ahmed. And Abiy's rise is significant because it reconfigures political power within the ruling party. So between 1991 and 2018, the country was run by a ruling coalition of ethnic parties. There were four called the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. And the center of gravity, or the dominant player in that coalition, was a group called the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which hails from Ethiopia's northern Tigray region, as many of your viewers will know, is really the epicenter of the recent conflict. But Abiy is able to come to power over and above the objections of the TPLF, and then spends subsequent months and years really trying to wrest control of the Ethiopian state, the country's political economy, from the TPLF. And the TPLF quite naturally resists that effort. So really from between 2018 and the outbreak of the conflict in Tigray in 2020, you see this kind of escalating power struggle within the ruling party over control of Ethiopia's governing arrangements, over control of the Ethiopian political center. Now, it wasn't a mere power struggle between ruling elites. There was an ideological element to what was going on as well. So the TPLF and the EPRDF, when they come to power in the early 1990s, install a system of ethnic federalism in the country, right? Anchored on a constitution, a federal constitution. The critique of the prime minister that emerges after 2018 is that he's essentially not sufficiently committed to ethnic federalism. So Ethiopia, since the mid-1990s, is comprised of a number of ethnic federal states, and Ethiopia's nations and nationalities in that context have autonomy that is afforded to them. And an added layer to this is that by 2019, the TPLF has basically left Ethiopia's federal institutions and has gone to its home base of Tigray region and controls that regional administration, right? So they not only do they have this historic commitment, at least in principle, to ethnic federalism, I don't think they govern the country in that way, but they are also seeking to maintain their autonomy and control of their own region, right? Because they control that administration. Yet another layer to this is the fact that there are a number of political forces in other regions of Ethiopia, particularly its two biggest, Oromia and Amhara, that are aligning themselves on different sides of this political divide because of the ideological stakes, because the country, the state has been unsettled by the elite fragmentation, and they're sort of jockeying for power and influence. And so a broader set of political forces are brought into this particular struggle. So at this point, a lot of it is sort of political rivalry, but there is a security dimension to this. There's spiraling violence, metastasizing violence in many parts of the country, well before the conflict breaks out in Tigray in 2020. So there are a lot of inflection points along the way. I'm condensing a lot of history, but the creation of the Prosperity Party in I think it was 2019, the postponement of national elections ostensibly due to COVID in 2020, subsequent regional elections in Tigray later that year, escalating disputes over something called Northern Command, which are federal units, the federal forces that are stationed in Tigray, which are really strategically significant for the national balance of power. All of the controversies around these issues really ratchet up political controversy and political tension between the various parties. And then that leads to the outbreak of war in November 2020. So that I think is effectively the backstory. And again, I'm condensing a lot of history here.
Thank you. That was a great Cliff's Notes version of what led up to the conflict. And then obviously in November, we saw a peace deal signed. So Alan, just turning to you, could you tell us a little bit about the peace process and where things currently stand?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think to sort of jump back to where Mike left off a little bit, I think first we need to talk about just how brutal and terrible this conflict has been. It's been it was the peace deal, I think, came as a surprise to many because it felt like one of these peace processes where the time was never right between the two sides to sit down and talk, despite just how costly this war was. By Crisis Group's estimation, the organization I work for, it's one of the most deadly conflicts during its duration, and some suggest it might have been the most deadly. And you could even say that just by battlefield casualties, when you expand that out to human casualties, the estimates pretty much all range in the hundreds of thousands of people. Some of that because of the very brutal essentially siege tactics that were put on Tigray by the federal government and neighboring regions and countries, including Eritrea, to essentially strangle Tigray, including with humanitarian aid and food, but to just spike the cost of the war as much as they could. We saw several rounds of the war. Early on, the TPLF, the Tigray leaders essentially lost control of Mekelle, the regional capital, reverted back into the countryside, into the mountains, where many sort of counted them, if not for dead, it counted them as a doomed fate as an insurgent group for a while. They stunned many by then storming back and retaking Mekelle, and then they launched they launched offensives outside of the Tigray region, and at a point even appeared to be marching on, or at least towards Addis Ababa as their objective. Then the tide turned again, and they were pushed back by the federal government back into the Tigray region. Then you have this long sort of lull, which at first was sort of unilateral truces, and then got a bit more formalized as a humanitarian truce. You finally saw some humanitarian aid flows happen. You saw diplomatic activity pick up. This was over essentially the spring and summer of last year. And then very tragically, you saw a full out war break out again near the end of the summer, and you had several months of incredibly large scale fighting. We need to say that most of this, pretty much all of this war has happened under a blackout because the media has been unable to access, and because of the telecoms and internet blackout in Tigray that was imposed upon it. It was very difficult to sort of get images of what was going on to the outside world. So you knew there was reports of just how terrible it was, but sort of in the absence of images and in the absence of journalists getting access, I'd say a lot of the world was rather unaware of the scale. So you had this new outbreak of violence. It looked like the federal government was once again going to retake control of Tigray. Potentially, it was making gains on several fronts. And a part of this, which I haven't delved into much, but it was the federal government forces fighting, but then also the Eritrean forces in Eritrea neighboring Tigray. And there's a lot more to get in there in terms of history, which Mike would also be a very good person to delve into that. But essentially, you had Tigray being fought they were this small region comprising less than 10% of Ethiopia's population was essentially fighting two national armies at the same time, in addition to regional forces. As Mike described, you have a federal system, so you had regional federal states as well that were fighting Tigray. So they were essentially besieged by all sides. We're losing ground, and then finally we got formal talks for the first time. It'd been a very messy process to get to talks for a number of reasons that we can get into later, but essentially the African Union finally hosted talks in South Africa with the US and the UN as key observers, and many didn't have high expectations for this, but what we essentially saw was that the Tigrayans finally raised the flag more or less and signed terms that looked to many like a negotiated surrender. They signed away many of their, they backed down and signed away many of their key objectives and made a number of concessions, but they stopped the fighting. And then since then, we've had this, we've had a kind of staged peace process. And I think there's a lot of things to say about the peace process, but one, I think the most important thing is that you have to be hopeful and optimistic. At this point, I think we have no choice but to be, primarily in the sense that we have two protagonists who have stopped fighting. I've been working, I'm not our Ethiopia expert at my organization, but I've been working on peace processes in this region for quite some time. And there's kind of two different broadly peace deals. You see peace deals where the main antagonists want to make it work, and you see peace deals where the main antagonists don't want to make it work. And it's very difficult, no matter how much outside pressure it is, to make parties that don't want to make a peace deal work, make it work. What we've seen thus far is a lot of initiative from both Addis Ababa and Mekelle, despite the very brutal fighting and despite the history, to continue muddling through making progress on the peace deal. Having said that, it is an incredibly difficult peace to implement, not least because, as we said, there was a number of forces fighting the Tigrayans, and the peace deal is essentially just between the federal government and the Tigray leadership itself. So the Eritreans, most importantly, were not part of the peace process. A lot of issues remain between the Amhara, Ethiopia's one of Ethiopia's most sort of powerful ethnic groups, but which neighbors the Tigray region. They got involved in the war. They seized territory that had belonged to Tigray since the advent of the federal period in the 90s, but which they claim as their own. But you have a lot of Amhara forces involved, but also you have a lot of essentially Amhara Tigray issues that still need to be resolved, that's not really part of this peace process. So you have a lot of outstanding issues. Meanwhile, the Tigrayans have agreed to a very fast disarmament process. They've been given a longer leash on that, but I think a lot of questions remain on exactly when and if the Tigrayans will disarm as they agreed, because they did agree to terms that were very costly for them on paper. So there's a lot of things to be worked out. That disarmament is more or less waiting technically. It was on the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces, as well as non-federal forces from the Tigray region. We have seen some withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from certain towns. A lot of this information is very hazy, but it's not clear that Eritrean forces have necessarily withdrawn from Tigray region itself. It appears some of them have probably been repositioned in more rural areas. So there's lots of impediments to the peace deal. However, we have seen aid flow come in. We've seen ongoing steps of normalization in relations between these two main antagonists. We've seen electricity and telecoms restored to a lot of Tigrayans. The most important thing is that for most Tigrayan people, life is much better now than it was several months ago, and hopefully they can keep up the progress. So there's a lot of space here for obviously backsliding. There's a huge amount of political issues to sort through. But I think just given the fact that it looks like there's currently political will to keep moving this forward, you have to have some optimism. If you're at all someone who wants to be optimistic, but I would love to hear also Mike's take on the current state of the peace process.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very helpful recap and a good reminder that an end to conflict isn't always the start of peace, but it sounds optimistic, and it sounds like there's some good things in place. But turning to Mike with a similar question, really, what are some of these issues that are unresolved? I think Alan mentioned some of them, and he also specifically mentioned the role of Eritrea, and so I'd love for you to shed some light on that, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Maybe I would just lead by echoing a point that Alan made, which is a lot of progress has already been made in reaching in implementing the peace deal, whether it's the return of some core public services, increases in levels of humanitarian assistance that are entering the region. There have been, the TPLF, Tigrayan authorities have made some moves on disarmament. So, so steps have been taken that are not easy for the parties to actually take, right? And I think that has to be noted. And again, as Alan has said, I think we really have no other choice but to be somewhat optimistic about the path forward. So challenges on the horizon in terms of achieving sustainable peace. I would actually divide these into sort of immediate challenges and more medium to long-term challenges. In terms of sort of immediate issues on the horizon, I do think, again, to echo Alan, I think the issue of the disarmament of Tigrayan forces and the withdrawal of, this is to use the language of the agreements themselves, foreign and non-federal forces from Tigray is probably going to be the most challenging. The parties in Nairobi committed to the disarmament of Tigrayan heavy weapons, and these withdrawals happening concurrently. I think that was the terminology used, so that each side has an incentive to follow through, right? So that you get the logic behind that. And I think there is some, as recently as yesterday, some evidence that the Tigrayan side is giving up its heavy weapons, or at least some of them. But I think it's less clear where we are on the withdrawal of Eritrean forces and an Amhara militia. Certainly the Tigrayan side is saying, if you look at their language, they're saying that these withdrawals have not happened or are not happening. And again, remember, to reiterate a point, Eritrea is not a party to the agreement. It has its own set of issues with Tigrayan authorities, including a border question, longstanding border question. And then on the Amhara side, many in the region have argued that their interests are not being adequately represented in this peace process. So, in that context, we're going to have to see whether the federal government, which is the party to the agreement, is going to be able to actually deliver on these withdrawals, and or whether there's some other understanding they're going to have to reach with the Tigrayan side. Right? So that it's really wait and see, I think, on that particular issue. On Eritrea, I mean, I'll also just say very, very briefly, I mean, I think it's, one issue, of course, is the withdrawal of forces. But I think the agreement, particularly if you look at the Pretoria Agreement, it also does call for a broader disengagement of Eritrea from Ethiopia's sort of internal affairs, right? And I think one has to note that Eritrea the Eritrean authorities have various points of leverage and levers that they can use in pursuing their own interests in Ethiopia. So you will have to see how that actually develops as well, recognizing Eritrea, like other countries in the neighborhood, have tangible interests in Ethiopia as well, right? If we think about the medium to longer term, I think there are several issues that are also going to require careful attention. Tigrayan forces are not simply being disarmed; they're also being it's a DDR. They're also being demobilized and reintegrated. And it would seem reintegrated into the formal security structures of the Tigray region and perhaps Ethiopia more broadly. And so at this stage, it's really quite ambiguous what that, particularly the reintegration piece, what that actually looks like. And you can imagine a lot of scope for disagreement between the parties. The agreements themselves also punt on some of the big political questions, big political issues. Again, Alan, you noted this, the issue, the status of Western Tigray or Wolkite and how to resolve it. The formation of an interim administration in Tigray, pending elections. I mean, those are going to be some pretty fraught issues. Something we haven't talked about, the issue of justice and accountability, right? This is something that's in the agreements. Ethiopia's partners, particularly Western partners, are pushing very hard on that issue. And I think some of the parties have very keen interests in pursuing that as well. And then finally, and I think this is really key, there's this fundamental question about how to connect this peace agreement in northern Ethiopia to a broader nationwide political settlement, because the conflict in Tigray, northern Ethiopia, is only one of a multitude of conflicts across the country. There's a particularly worrisome and metastasizing conflict now underway in Oromia, which really sits at the center of Ethiopia, both literally and figuratively. It's very difficult to imagine a sustainable peace process in the north while the rest of the country is sort of falling apart. But it's not clear. It's not actually clear how the peace process, the peace track we're on now, actually fits into this broader potential broader arrangement. So I think those are some of the issues. I'm sure there are others, but again, I would just underscore the progress that's already happened.
I mean, it's remarkable, and especially given, Alan, what you had said about just how brutal the conflict was, to have put a stop to that largely is very encouraging and impressive. I'm going to try to get in a few more questions before we turn to the Q&A box. And if you're listening and if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. Alan, just turning to you, just looking a little bit more broadly, what have been the regional implications of this conflict, and how have other countries in the Horn of Africa responded to the developments on there?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Ethiopia is the giant of the Horn of Africa, I would say, and it's an unstable Ethiopia is bound to basically affect all of its neighbors. You would have some neighbors who, might welcome not having a strong giant basically involved in their own affairs, but also the instability of Ethiopia has really destabilized, I would say, a lot of the region. And we can get into country by country, but I'd say generally speaking, a lot of the work of the previous couple decades, especially on building a sort of regional security, peace and security architecture, as diplomats like to say, in the Horn of Africa, really centered around the role of Ethiopia, which makes sense given its size and geographical position. And so you saw Ethiopia play really prominent roles in the peace process in South Sudan, which got independence in 2011, but very quickly found a civil war, and it's still struggling to essentially find its footing. And that was a very Ethiopian-driven process originally. It's been involved for better or for ill at times in Somalia, but it's been quite central to the sort of regional approach in Somalia, which when working well was, or at least when working better, was fairly coordinated with Kenya. And then you also had a decent relationship with Sudan that extended for some time. You have a lot of historical, there's a lot of historical volatility in the relations between Sudan and Ethiopia historically, but you had seen a period of relative good relations. Sudan is also, even after the split, but before South Sudan divided, it was a very huge country as well, which has many of its own issues. But Ethiopia and Prime Minister Abiy, before facing a lot of these issues really acutely at home, had played a role in helping broker a way forward after the Sudanese revolution that toppled its longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. And so Ethiopia did have this capacity to play very active roles in places like South Sudan and Sudan when crises arose. And essentially the Horn of Africa lost that when in the past couple years. I think we'd all like to think that it would be in a position to play a bit more of that role soon, but that's probably asking too much. It also, Ethiopia's instability, in some ways, just created opportunities for cross-border meddling, which brings the Horn of Africa sort of back to some of its darker chapters, where basically most countries were engaged in proxy wars with neighbors, and there was broad instability, and everyone essentially had their fingers in each other's pots, and it was very difficult to untangle that because it didn't. Those sort of proxy wars are just very difficult to sort of cease and untangle. It gets quite messy, and the dynamics sort of feed on each other. And so we've seen some worrying signs that some of these dynamics are starting to creep back. So Ethiopia's instability has weakened the region. Absolutely, it's lost a key leader. That's not to say some countries, in particular, I'd say, Eritrea, for instance, might see that it has an interest in a weaker Ethiopia. So it's not to say some countries wouldn't welcome it to a bit, but I think it's obvious the region is much weaker, and it's raised this question of basically who can come in and assist in places like Sudan, South Sudan, when Ethiopia is not in the picture. It's hard for a country like Kenya to do it on its own, for instance. But then you've had a lot of Gulf powers from the Middle East, as well as Turkey as well, get increasingly involved. And of course, you still have the US, the UK, European countries as well. And you have the African Union, who's starting, to take more and more of a sort of lead on many of those. But in essence, it's been actually quite ad hoc and quite chaotic. Not just in Ethiopia, but for the surrounding countries as well during this period.
Great, thank you, Alan. And you touched on a couple of issues that I wanted to get into with Mike right now, which is what are the role of outside powers such as the United States in general in the peace process? How does the U.S. view the Horn of Africa in strategic terms? And just to throw one more on there that has also been touched on, China has economic interest in Ethiopia, and what has its policy been toward the conflict, and what role are they playing now?
Yep, sure. So just again to go back to the last question and add a bit, or just give you my perspective, on neighboring countries. I mean, so I think Eritrea requires its own analytical treatment, but other countries in the region, I think, are my read is going forward are going to be pretty keen to see this peace process consolidated. I think all of them, although beyond Sudan, many of them didn't really say it openly, were quite worried about humanitarian and security spillover of the conflict. And so, and indeed, the Kenyans themselves have been very active in the peace process, played a very significant role in getting to where we are now, right? So I think you're going to see, by and large, a supportive regional environment, but we'll see. And again, Eritrea, I think, requires its own analytical treatment, and I don't think we actually really know the state of their strategic thinking on this actual peace process. So on the United States, look, I think from when the Biden administration comes in, so we're in early 2021. I think a core tenet of U.S. policy was to encourage a political solution to the conflict, right? Negotiations. So in some ways, what we've seen now is a realization of a long-standing policy goal, right? And the United States took that diplomatic line. There were other aspects to U.S. policy, achieving humanitarian access, pushing for an end to atrocities and accountability for them. They were very consistent in calling, alongside the Europeans, calling for an Eritrean withdrawal. But when the parties got to a point where they were actually, given that backdrop, given that policy line, when the parties got to a place where they were actually willing to talk to one another, at least privately, the United States then played the role of facilitator or mediator, right? So in early 2022, you get this humanitarian pause or ceasefire, and the United States in Djibouti and the Seychelles is facilitating back channel negotiations between the parties, right? Very different from the public talks we had in Pretoria later that year. So the U.S. it's not just rhetoric; it's actively involved, I think, in peace diplomacy. When you come to the more recent talks that took place in Pretoria at the end of 2022, I think the U.S. did play a role. I mean, I think they applied pressure on the parties themselves to actually pursue a political solution. I think they very directly sought to catalyze the AU and big AU member states like the Kenyans and the South Africans to get a peace process moving. I think everyone understood that if you were going to have a peace process, it was going to have to be anchored within African or AU structures, right? And then, of course, at a very practical level, the U.S. Played a very important role in sort of logistics and security arrangements in terms of getting the Tigrayans out of Tigray, to the talks, right? So they're basically flying on U.S. planes, right? And as I understand it, you've got a U.S. special envoy for the Horn of Africa who is flying with Tigray negotiators as a guarantee of their safety, right? So I think the U.S. played a pretty big role in getting to talks. At the Pretoria talks, the U.S. is an observer role, and that's significant because it's actually the only country that is in an observer role. The other observers were multilaterals, the United Nations, and I think Alan can correct me if I'm wrong, and IGAD, right? And then you've got, of course, the AU and a panel, high-level panel that's handling the mediation. But once at the talks, I have to say it's not really clear to me, although the U.S. was an observer role, how significant or decisive U.S. diplomacy was. I mean, you hear conflicting things, right? You hear that the U.S. was quite active and played an important role. On the other hand, you hear that the U.S. wasn't in the room at key junctures. So it's honestly really hard for me to assess at this point how decisive they were. But I do think just the mere fact that the U.S. was heavily engaged was quite important, because I think the parties themselves understood that if they wanted to maintain or if they want their relations with the United States to improve, they were going to need to really compete, or rather commit to these peace talks. And in the case of the Ethiopian government, this is quite vital because the country is in pretty difficult economic conditions. It's looking at really important structural economic support from the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. So it had a real interest, I think, in seeing its relationship with the United States and the West more generally normalized. And of course, I think that the TPLF saw the dangers of running afoul of Western partners as well. So I think they played a role. Just very quickly on China, so I don't, before I forget. I mean, I think my assessment is China didn't play really any role in this peace process, right? I mean, there was, in mid-2022, the Chinese had held, I think it was in Addis Ababa, a peace conference for the Horn of Africa. There was really no follow-up to that. If you read the communique that came out of that session. There's really no direct reference to the conflicts in Ethiopia around the region, I'd also add that the Chinese diplomatic posture, particularly at the UN Security Council throughout the conflict, was really to sort of block any multilateral engagement on the Ethiopia crisis, right? So they blocked at repeated intervals efforts to hold public sessions or open sessions at the UN Security Council on Ethiopia. They blocked, along with the Russians and some African members of the Security Council, blocked UN Security Council statements on the crisis. So I think that's how I would summarize the Chinese position.
Great, thank you. We're getting some good questions coming in from the Q&A box. Before I turn to that, I just wanted to get just pick up one final thread with you, Alan. The AU and their role has been referenced several times, and I'd just be curious to get your take on how they come out of this and how they are as an actor in the region, what their role has meant for them going.
Yeah, great question. The AU's role has been controversial, to say the least. I would say mostly before this peace deal, but also after to a degree. But I think we have to start by saying the AU is in a very difficult position. Its headquarters is in Addis Ababa. Imagine this is far from a perfect analogy, but imagine the United Nations being asked to lead a peace process in the US when the US government didn't want it to. I mean, it's just a very, very challenging situation. It's always difficult for these multilateral institutions to deal with very large countries, but especially when they're headquartered there. So, however, having said that, a lot of people are still quite disappointed in the AU's kind of initial response. For quite a while, you had not officially competing, but I think most would say fairly more or less unofficially competing peace tracks. This is before we had formal peace talks, so they weren't competing peace processes, but you had often the Ethiopian government saying it wanted an AU peace process, which is difficult to argue with, but was comfortable for them because partly because the AU, I think, was headquartered there. And the Tigrayans for a while more or less rejected the AU as a mediator, and then they rejected the AU envoy itself, former Nigerian President Obasanjo, and they preferred Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta. So skipping kind of forward through a lot of the diplomatic intrigue, the AU took a long time to get to formally invite parties for talks. Even when they invited talks, as sort of people felt it wasn't very serious at times and wasn't even potentially in good faith. But then, you have to give the AU credit for brokering in its first round of peace talks a peace deal that is still held firm. So I think it obviously received it played a controversial role, but it's produced a peace deal which is holding. And I think we have to recognize the AU in many ways was probably the only institution who could properly do that. The US tried to do this, kind of on its own and through, kind of quiet talks, and then encouraging other leaders to take a role. But nowadays, in the current era, for a peace process to properly have legitimacy, it often needs to and should include the AU, if not as one of the main actors, but hopefully as a lead actor. So I think how the AU peace process still faces a fair amount of criticism. A lot of people felt the way the peace deal was structured, especially in terms of the monitoring mechanisms, was quite weak, and would like to see the AU bump that up. But it's obviously been a victory for the AU, and what's been a very difficult situation it's found itself in with civil war in Ethiopia. But I think the difficulties, as Michael has said, despite my claim that we have to have optimism, obviously there will be major hiccups in this peace process moving forward, and the AU is going to remain in a very difficult position moving forward with this. So this isn't a closed chapter, but I think it would be great to see in the history books if this ends up being a triumph for the AU. That would be great to see. Yeah.
Great. thank you. Turning to you, Mike, we have a question in the question box that asks, what provisions, if any, does the peace deal set for interethnic dialogue and reconciliation in Ethiopia? And what will this look like given the history of interethnic tensions and distrust in the country?
It's a good question, and I think I'd actually have to go back and review not just the agreement. There are actually multiple agreements we're talking about here. But I do think if we get away from the agreement, there is it's been much maligned, but there is a process, a national dialogue effort that includes some interethnic dialogue components that is being promoted by the federal government. And is being situated as really a solution, or one solution to some of these historic ethnic tensions. It's been much maligned because some critics don't think it's inclusive enough. They see the process of being stage managed by the federal government. But to the extent that process, and this gets back to an issue I was mentioning earlier, can be made more inclusive, can involve more participation from civil society, and can be connected to the peace process in the North. I think that would be a good outcome, right? But obviously, I think the concern raised by the questioner is an important one, is that there is a history of interethnic cooperation in Ethiopia, longstanding, and you have a huge number of Ethiopians that are of mixed ethnic background. There's a basis, I think, for interethnic cooperation, but that challenge of how do you reconcile a historically diverse country, ethnically diverse country, with a very serious history of ethnic exclusion, marginalization. How do you address those issues? I think is going to be a really decisive question going forward.
Great, thank you. Alan, we have a question that asks, on multiple occasions, Facebook Meta has been accused of fake news or worsening the conflict in Ethiopia. What role has social media played in the conflict, and what role do you see it playing in the future peace process?
Yeah, that's a great and very interesting question. One that I think is actually quite challenging to actually research in practice in terms of following causal chains. There's a lot of inference, I think, when a lot of things get written about. There are instances where they can pinpoint exact instances in which perhaps a post on Facebook might have led to specific acts of violence. But those are harder to pinpoint than just the kind of very toxic, polarized political climate that really characterized this war. And that's what people mostly think of when they think of social media. That's Facebook, that's Twitter, but almost anyone who's engaged or has paid attention at all to the Ethiopian conflict has noticed just how polarized the online environment has been, especially on ethnic lines. And it's been really, social media became a weapon of both sides during the war. It also, I think it'd be difficult to argue that it didn't serve as a further polarizing agent in the conflict as well. Thankfully, we have seen that itself is not a limitation to the political elites moving forward with the peace process based off their own calculations. So I think, it's been terrible to sort of wade through the Ethiopian online discourse, I think, through much of this, but also it's not like it made peace processes entirely different. The other thing I just want to highlight is Facebook didn't create the political problems and the real debates, as Mike mentioned. There are real ideological debates here as well about and real legitimate political discussions that Ethiopians need to have. And so it can become very difficult in a place like Ethiopia to actually differentiate what's legitimate political discourse and illegitimate hate speech. I know that might sound strange perhaps to some people, but given the ethnic lines and how it falls, and given how Ethiopian politics sort of lays out, I think in practice, when you look at what a place like Facebook would have to actually wade through and mediate, it becomes a very difficult proposition indeed. However, I do think it's very fair for someone like Meta, I kept using Facebook, but someone like Meta to face criticism for essentially paying a fair amount of attention to the criticism about what happens in a place like the US, and facing very little and putting very few resources comparatively into its impact in a place like Ethiopia, although of course it's not the only example. I think its role in Myanmar has been looked at quite heavily, et cetera. So it is a very interesting one. Obviously, social media has made this, I think, a different color of a conflict than even previous ones in Ethiopian history. And I think probably academics will spend and scholars will spend a lot of time moving forward trying to sort of unpack that. But it hasn't remade the politics either. It's been, I think it's obviously been an amplifying factor, but it's not like it might be wrong to just suggest we're in an entirely new political era because of it as well. But I do think Meta deserves the scrutiny that it gets on this.
Great, thank you. Mike, turning to you with a technical question, is Addis Ababa the only implementer of the DDR process? And if so, what is the chance of success if there's not another implementer, such as the UN or the AU? Is there a good recent example of an African national government single-handedly implementing a DDR process as a model?
Yeah. So my sense is that if you look at the agreements carefully, that it's probably not right to characterize the federal government as the sole implementer of DDR, right? So there is a joint commission comprised of government representatives, or federal government representatives, Tigrayan Authority representatives that manage the DDR process. And then there's a monitoring and verification mechanism that works through the AU. And that's already, in the last couple of weeks, that monitoring and verification mechanism has already been put together. So I think you've got military officers from Kenya, South Africa, maybe Nigeria, if I recall correctly, that are on the ground monitoring all aspects of the agreement, right? Not just DDR, but I think also in the end will monitor the withdrawal and movement of troops. And so now, all that being said, I think when the initial agreement was released, there were concerns from observers about monitoring and verification, and the feeling was that the mechanisms that existed were not robust and were fairly weak in terms of the size of the monitoring and verification mechanism. And also the fact that the onus was solely on the AU in terms of monitoring and verification. As I understand it, the Tigrayan side at the negotiating table pushed for a UN role, right? And was keen to bring in other parties because of, and I think Alan discussed this, their perceptions that the AU was biased in favor of Addis. But this is where we are, right? And so the AU is going to play a pretty critical and significant role in the DDR process at the end of the day.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Alan, turning to you, I wanted to get your take on the economic piece, right? Ethiopia had, fairly high GDP growth rates up until around 2017, and costs of reconstruction are pretty high. Between the global impacts of crises, food shortages caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, impact and recession, inflation and recession impacting global markets. It sounds like Ethiopia's situation right now is a fairly dire economic one. And so how do you see Abiy navigating this fine line between economic hardship so that it does not fuel further instability and, an ability to make sure that, any sort of outside investment or propping up is properly managed? How does the economic piece factor into all of this?
Well, I think well, it's very good that we raised this before we ran out the economic situation that Ethiopia is in, and B, I think the really interesting question is how to sort of how to bring the sort of necessary support and sequence the necessary support that Ethiopia is going to need and really needs now economically, while continuing to incentivize a peace process that many diplomats and people we talk to and Ethiopians essentially think that the Ethiopian government only got very serious about when it faced a serious financial crunch and was really suffering from the sort of international isolation, especially Western isolation, that came about from this context. So there was a real sense that this economic difficulties and its need for support, even bailouts, et cetera, more or less, played a very crucial role in part of the calculus of the Ethiopian government moving ahead and kind of giving peace a chance. And I think there's a lot of skepticism about how this would go, but at least opening the door to giving peace a chance. So one of the concerns, although I think the further the peace process moves along, this concern is going to diminish, is that just opening sort of the economic floodgates to support Ethiopia economically, which it needs very much. There was a concern that would decrease the sort of carrot, the incentive to continue moving forward with the peace process. So I think that's a real sort of devil's dilemma that a lot of Western countries, especially, I think, are sort of grappling with. And I think it's a difficult one, but again, the more momentum the peace process gets, the better. I also think I think it's really key that there be, oftentimes the world comes in with sanctions threats, and it doesn't. And then when you have a case where you need the reconstruction of Tigray or other positive things that come, with dividends of peace, the world sort of disappears and everyone, goes back into the corner and they don't come forward with the sort of donor conferences and pledges that are really necessary. So I think it's really important here for there not just to be, withholding of aid, but also to say when you succeed in making this peace and move on and, hit, whether it's official benchmarks or not, that there is all this support here to really help Ethiopia move forward. I think that's really critical. I don't think we, really ever see enough of that, quite frankly. But in fairness to Ethiopia, I also think it's just worth pointing out what a terrible global and regional context this has been for Ethiopia. A lot of countries in the global South and Africa and the region are facing a really hard time right now with commodity shocks. And the global financial situation, and are facing really difficult situations with the debt load they have as well. So it hit also Ethiopia at a difficult time.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that. Mike, turning to you, we had another question about Eritrea. When the questioner asked, as mentioned, Eritrea will play a major role in whether the peace process will be successful. Is there any outside power that has influence over that country's autocratic leader?
Well, I think this has been one challenge, right? That many in the international community have been trying to sort out, which is, what are the players in the international system that can actually engage the Eritrean government, that have leverage sufficient to get them to do the things that are necessary to implement the agreement, namely their withdrawal from Tigray, and I would think other parts of Ethiopia. Because of course, the Ethiopia's traditional partners in the West have pretty poor relations with Eritrea, and there's a long backstory to that. So I think one line of thinking here is that the Gulf countries, particularly the UAE, the Saudis, have lines of communication with Asmara that the West really doesn't have, and may have some leverage that they can deploy. But I don't think as yet there's really any evidence that's a strategy that has or can work, right? It just but that is one something that you'll hear in Western capitals, that if we can just get the Saudis and Emiratis on board, we can get some movement from the Eritreans. But I don't think we've really seen that plan actualized yet.
Great, thank you. In like the 30 seconds we have left, just a really quick lightning round. What is the thing that you're looking at down the road that kind of gives you hope? Like, what are you looking for that says, this is going one positive direction or not? Alan, I'll start with you. What are you keeping your eye out for?
I've become a bit allergic to specific benchmarks, and because I I think we get too tied to them. So very quickly, to see the sides continue to make progress and to find when they hit inevitable obstacles, to find a way to keep moving forward. I think that's and because that shows real political will, at least at the moment, to try to make this work. And I think that's the most critical factor. And I think thus far we've mostly seen that. Yeah.
Great, good. Mike, what about you?
Not much I would add. I mean, I think I wouldn't. I mean, I think, to get more specific, I mean, I think the concurrent disarmament and withdrawal is really the game at the moment. And if that can be achieved, that would be pretty significant sign that we're on a sustainable path here. But there are other benchmarks I think one could highlight as well. I think, the optics, some of the optics of the peace agreement that we've seen recently, with high-level visits from Addis to Mekelle, is really, that's sort of like a positive sign, and really key, I think, to building a coalition for peace that's going to be necessary to sustain this thing.
Great, wonderful. Well, it's nice to have, a somewhat positive developments to talk about today. And, thank you both for the work you do, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone in the audience. There were some really fantastic questions. Just a couple housekeeping items. Our next event is on Tuesday, the 17th. It's with Michael Koplow. We're going to be talking about Israel's hard right turn. This is a member-only event. If you're interested, you can scan to RSVP, and then you can get more information about how to become a member if you're not. We also have a briefing with Martin Wolf about Brexit coming up on Tuesday, January 24th. And that one is free and open to everyone around the world. And then, last but not least, we are a nonprofit. We really want to keep all of these conversations going and covering as much of the world as we can. So if you enjoyed this and, have a little capacity to donate, no amount is too small, we really appreciate it. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Alan. Really appreciate it. It was a fascinating conversation. And thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.